Today is our first set, and tonight we have another at 5:30, and then tomorrow morning at 9:30. So thanks everybody for coming. We've got 3 great presentations today. The first is going to be Belle Fleming, and I will let her introduce her study. Each presenter is probably going to go 20 minutes or so, and have plenty of time for questions, and then we'll transition to the next person and go from there. So thank you all very much for coming.
Hi everybody, thank you all for being here. As Bob said, my name is Belle Fleming, and today I'm going to be talking about my research on rape myth acceptance and college students' perceptions of participating in sexual assault prevention programs. And I conducted this research under the supervision of Dr. Robert Swope. Before I start, I'd just like to say that some of what I'm going to be talking about is sensitive material, so if at any point you feel uncomfortable or would just rather step out, please feel free to do so. Okay. Rape and sexual assault have long been a problem on college campuses and among college-aged individuals. The CDC reports that nearly 1 in 5 women and 1 in 72 men will experience a rape at some point in their lives. Although the prevalence of sexual assault can be fairly difficult to predict, most people experience sexual violence as young adults. So approximately 42.2% of female victims reported being raped before the age of 18, and approximately 37.4% between the ages of 18 and 24, which is of course the age that most people are when they attend college. In addition, 90% of undergraduate women report having experienced some form of attempted or completed sexual assault since entering college. There are many widespread social misconceptions surrounding rape and sexual assault. For example, that perpetrators are most often strangers in dark shadows, or a high percentage of rapes are falsely reported. And these misconceptions tend to contribute to a climate where rape is seen as justifiable. The term rape myth was first defined by Martha Burt in 1980 as prejudicial, stereotyped, or false beliefs about rape, rape victims, and rapists. The term was redefined in 1994 by Kimberly Lonsway and Louise Fitzgerald to more accurately include the definition of a myth, and rape myths are now most commonly defined as attitudes and beliefs that are generally false, but are widely and persistently held, and that serve to deny and justify male sexual aggression towards women. Now, you'll notice that this definition is limited in that it only accounts for sexual violence that's committed by men against women. And there's a few reasons for this. Number one, although sexual assault occurs in many different forms, this is the most common model. So men are overwhelmingly the perpetrators of such acts, and women tend to be the victims the majority of the time. In addition, rape myths themselves reflect a distorted and stereotyped view of sexual assault, and therefore focus exclusively on violence that's perpetrated by men against women. And so the theoretical definition is designed to incorporate this idea. Some examples of commonly held rape myths are that men can't be raped, that, quote, good girls are not raped, that any healthy woman could resist a rape if she really wanted to, or that rapists are insane, sex-starved, or both. Such myths did not originate by accident, and in fact they tend to play a very functional role within society. Namely, they serve to justify rape and sexual assault by switching the blame from the perpetrator to the victim, and in doing so they prevent societies from having to examine the true nature or extent of sexual assault. They also contribute to a viewpoint of a just world in which good things happen to good people and bad things happen only to those who deserve them. So individuals who endorse rape myths tend to justify the sexual assault of others through the use of this mentality, and in doing so they are prevented from having to examine their own role in contributing to rape culture while reassuring themselves that rape is not something that will ever really happen to them. In fact, higher levels of rape myth acceptance have correlated with higher levels of homophobia, increased likelihood of raping based on self-report measures, more aggressive and negative attitudes towards victims, greater levels of victim blaming, greater adherence towards traditional gender roles, and more sympathy towards offending males. In addition, men with higher levels of rape myth acceptance also demonstrate higher rape proclivity, and in both college and non-college student samples, individuals with higher levels of rape myth acceptance were less likely to label a particular scenario as a rape, even when it met the legal criteria. As you can imagine, rape myths are often perpetuated through legislation, social discourse, and the media plays a huge role in this as well. There are currently a few important pieces of legislation that are in place surrounding sexual assault in college campuses, and I would just like to touch on a few of those briefly. One is the Jeanne-Cleary Act, also known as the Student Right to Know and Campus Security Act of 1990, which states that all colleges and universities that receive federal aid must openly disclose crime statistics, including those pertaining to sexual violence in and around campuses. This law has been amended multiple times, and one of the most notable amendments occurred in 1992, and that was the Campus Sexual Assault Victims Bill of Rights, which requires that schools create prevention policies in addition to providing victims with certain assurances. The most recent amendment was in March of 2013, and that was known as the Campus Save Act, which gave specific provisions for prevention measures, which are right up here, you can read them, and also afforded additional rights to victims of sexual violence, dating and domestic violence, and stalking. Despite this legislation, a 2005 report by the Department of Justice found that although most schools do openly disclose crime statistics, I don't know if she was good. Okay. Only about 1/3 of schools were fully in compliance with federal legislation. In addition, out of schools that offered general education programming, less than 1/3 included prevention programs as part of their general student body activities. And among four-year institutions, fewer than half included such programs. Overall, only 4 out of 10 schools included any type of sexual assault prevention training, and that was often offered only to individuals who were involved in residence life or campus security, rather than to general student populations. Many of the sexual assault programs that have been designed for college and university populations have sought to reduce sexual assault by means of rape myth acceptance reduction, in addition to teaching self-protective and self-defense strategies and alcohol and drug awareness. Such programs have been shown to have positive yet somewhat limited effects, and overall the research surrounding prevention programs is fairly small in scope. Very few researchers have taken the student experience into account or tried to examine these issues from the student perspective. Which brings us to the present study, which serves to add to this limited research by assessing students' ideas about participating in rape and sexual assault prevention programs, and by examining the ways in which these ideas relate to levels of rape myth acceptance. Given the correlations that I talked about between rape myth acceptance and other attitudes and behaviors that contribute to rape culture, I present the following 3 hypotheses. Number 1, students with a higher level of rape myth acceptance will be more resistant to the idea of institution-wide prevention programming. Number 2, students with a higher level of rape myth acceptance will be less likely to see themselves as the target audience for prevention programming. And hypothesis number 3, students with higher levels of rape myth acceptance will be less likely to indicate that they have an individual role in the prevention of rape and sexual assault. Participants for the study were 159 students from a variety of colleges and universities. Most of the participants, a little less than 79%, came from right here at Warren Wilson, and the other 21 or so% came from a variety of schools, including both public and private schools, state schools, and large and small institutions, although in all cases, liberal arts was still the primary focus. Participants were recruited using a series of emails that were sent through campus directories, as well as through advertising on social media outlets such as Facebook and Tumblr. 344 responses were received in all, but out of those, only 159 individuals completed the testing materials in full, so that's why 159 individuals make up the final sample. Participants were tested via a survey which consisted of a consent statement, the Illinois Rape Myth Acceptance Scale short form, or the IRMA SF, a written description of a sexual assault prevention program, and an open-ended questionnaire that followed the written description. The Illinois Rape Myth Acceptance Scale was originally created as a 45-item questionnaire in 1999, and since then it has been revised and shortened to 22 questions. Numerous studies have demonstrated the construct validity of the scale, and it is now one of the most commonly used scales today in assessing rape myth attitudes. When completing the scale, participants are presented with 22 statements designed to reflect a commonly held rape myth, and are asked to rate their level of agreement with each of the statements. So some examples of statements are, if a girl is raped while she's drunk, she's at least somewhat responsible for letting things get out of hand. It shouldn't be considered rape if a guy was drunk and didn't know what he was doing. Or oftentimes girls who say they were raped agreed to have sex and then regretted it afterwards. Participants received between 1 and 5 points depending on their level of agreement with each of the statements. And for this study, higher scores on the IRMA SF indicated lower levels of rape myth acceptance, and lower scores on the IRMA SF indicated higher levels of rape myth acceptance. The open-ended questionnaire that followed the IRMA scale contained 3 questions designed to assess hypothesis 1, 1 question designed to assess hypothesis 2, 1 question designed to assess hypothesis 3, and 2 additional questions which asked students about their feelings in relation to gender targeting with prevention programs. So as you can see, they asked whether or not one gender should be made to go more than another, or should be included or targeted more than another. The questionnaire, or the program description that preceded this open-ended questionnaire contained a variety, was created by compiling the most common aspects of programs that have been tested with college and university populations. So all of the exercises and activities, as well as the general structure of the description, came from actual programs. The questionnaire responses were coded using inductive content analysis and were subsequently quantified. Participants were given 3 points for a positive or yes answer, 2 points for a neutral or maybe answer, and 1 point for a negative or no answer. In the case of hypothesis 1, the answers to the 3 questions were added to produce one number that reflected the degree of positivity that students felt towards the program. All of the questionnaire scores were then correlated with the IRMA SF scores using a series of Spearman and Pearson's correlations. These tests showed that there was a significant positive correlation between IRMA SF scores and positivity towards the program scores, which demonstrates support for hypothesis 1. In relation to hypothesis 2, there did not seem to be any significant relationship between IRMA SF scores and whether or not students saw themselves as the target audience for the program. Although in examining the student responses a little bit further, I was able to gain some insight into why this lack of a relationship may have occurred. Many of the students who indicated that they were not the target audience for the program also talked about being very knowledgeable about these issues already. So some mentioned having participated in gender studies classes or otherwise been exposed to a program of this type before. So for those individuals, it would make sense that they would have relatively low levels of rate myth acceptance, but still might not see themselves as the target audience for such programs. In relation to hypothesis 3, there was a significant positive correlation between IRMA SF scores and whether or not students saw themselves as having an individual role in the prevention of rape and sexual assault. So hypotheses 1 and 3 were largely supported, indicating that students with lower levels of rate myth acceptance are more likely to respond positively to prevention programming and are more likely to see themselves as having an individual role in the prevention of rape and sexual assault. Responses to the open-ended questionnaires were further examined to assess percentages of positive, negative, and neutral responses, as well as to identify key themes and points of rationale that were present in the participant responses. For the sake of time, I can't talk about all of these themes today, although I would like to touch on a few. Behind me, you can see the frequency breakdown of how students responded to each question. As you can see, the most variability occurred in response to the question of whether or not the program should be made mandatory. I don't know if this later point works. No, okay. I'm not good at technology. Whether or not the program should be made mandatory, whether or not students would attend the program voluntarily, and then once again, down here, whether or not students saw themselves as the target audience for such programs. In terms of the question of whether or not students would, or whether or not to make the program mandatory, one of the biggest themes that emerged were concerns about there being a lack of student seriousness. So about students not taking the program seriously or putting effort into the program if they were required to go. There was also concerns raised about the program being triggering to students who had experienced sexual assault or trauma in the past. So some examples of responses that reflect these themes are: I hesitate to say that it would be completely successful. I say this because I think when things are mandatory, sometimes students aren't necessarily open to whatever it is they are being forced to go to. But I am in full support of having this on campus. I think that it is a difficult thing to decide and that mandatory programs are frequently laughed off or seen as overbearing and therefore diminished on some level. Psychologically, it's not the greatest method. Having experienced this particular trauma, I would feel backed into a corner if I were required to take this course. I would think that is BS. For people who have experienced the trauma personally, it could be a serious emotional trigger, and they're not going to say why they don't want to be a part of it if they haven't publicly announced that they were sexually molested. Offering the program, yes, that is good. I don't know if these mandatory programs do as much as they crack themselves up to being able to do. Now, the follow-up question to this one was whether or not students would attend the program voluntarily. And around this question, there also emerged a theme of concerns about the program not reaching the target audience if it was left up to the choice of the student as to whether or not to go. So some examples of those responses are: yes, but I worry that the students who do attend would be primarily female or people who already take an interest in and are aware of issues involving sexual assault and consent. I think that only students who are aware of / interested in these issues would show up. I know this from personal experience dealing with people who need the education the most. They don't see a problem, so they're not going to attend a program that intends to solve a problem that they don't think, or that they think doesn't exist, or a problem that benefits them, i.e. the problem of abusers being let off easily. Time was also a notable factor in these responses, as well as participants feeling as though they were already knowledgeable about this information already. Taken together, the responses to these two questions demonstrate the complexity of reaching a large number of students. Support for a mandatory program was not strong enough to assure its success. However, there also appeared to be a belief that the program would not reach the target audience, or the students that might need the information the most wouldn't attend if they were left out of their own volition. Still, a large majority of the participants indicated that the program they read about would be beneficial within the context of their college or university. And the most prevalent theme that emerged around these answers was that sexual assault and rape were things that were present on the participants' campuses. So individuals talked about either having experienced the trauma personally, knowing a friend or a peer who had experienced the trauma, or otherwise just hearing about these events happening on their campuses. So some examples of responses that illustrate this theme are, yes, we have a problem with sexual assault on this campus that many people don't recognize, and this program seems like a good way to educate the community. Very much so. Sexual assault, while not prevalent, occurs at my school and has not been addressed in an effectively preventative and inclusive manner. Yes, I've heard of people at a specific house drugging girls and raping them. Yes, many rapes occur and go unreported on my college campus, and I think it would be very beneficial for males and females alike to know what truly constitutes a rape and what doesn't. The other side of this question, or the other side of these responses, was that participants who demonstrated less support for the program or indicated that it would not be beneficial within the context of their school talked about, again, being knowledgeable about these issues already and not really needing to attend a program further, or mentioned that sexual assault was not happening on their campuses, or at least not in large enough numbers for it to be a concern. So some examples of those statements are, I think it would be beneficial, but would be tricky because we are already so progressive. The program would have to acknowledge that the problems we have go beyond what's usually considered the basics of abuse education in order to be taken seriously. No, there is already so much of this talk at my college and so little actual sexual assault. Clearly, the people who would do this sort of thing are not affected by talking about ways to avoid sexual assault. Maybe not beneficial. We are already very anti-sexual assault and it doesn't happen often. Once again, these two sets of responses illustrate the complexity of tackling these issues, and I think they also demonstrate just how much a person's individual experience can shape the perception of what is beneficial for their campus. In terms of the question designed to assess Hypothesis 3, which asked students whether or not they felt they had an individual role in preventing rape and sexual assault, and also asked them to clarify what that role looked like, the most common roles that emerged were in order bystander intervention, peer education, and practicing consent. So individuals talked about intervening in situations where they felt as though sexual assault could be taking place, namely party situations or places where drugs and alcohol were present. They also talked about engaging in discussions about sexual assault with peers and encouraging their peers to see sexual assault as a serious issue, and also talked about practicing consent with sexual partners. And this came in two forms. One was obtaining positive verbal consent with their partners before initiating any sexual contact, and the other side of it was the individual themselves learning how to voice their needs or speak out when they themselves were feeling uncomfortable and encourage their partner to practice consent with them. The last set of responses that I think are important to take note of were students' responses to the two questions pertaining to gender targeting. Overwhelmingly, participants seem to be in favor of all gender programming that includes and targets all genders equally. The dominant themes that arose around this question were, one, that rape and sexual assault are things that are perpetuated at a societal level, and therefore that they affect everybody. And two, that targeting or including one gender more than another would be an act of sexism and or non-inclusive. So some examples of responses that illustrate this theme, or these themes are, it absolutely needs to be available to all gender identities. Rape and sexual assault is not limited to one class, race, gender, etc. It spans across all boundaries. Though there is a bias in society toward women being victimized incredibly often, it is not right to exclude others due to societal bias. Everyone deserves to know how to protect themselves and others and engage in healthy, safe, and consensual relationships, sexual and otherwise. It needs to be required for everyone. Firstly, there are non-binary students. Secondly, heterosexuality isn't the only sexuality. And thirdly, rape knows no gender. I feel like it would be highly damning to single out men for education about sexual assault and rape culture. The same of women. That would be highly sexist, and both groups deserve equal treatment. This shows that overall, students may be more receptive to programs that are designed to be gender inclusive. Although it is important to note that there is some research which indicates that gender separation can be a positive thing within the context of prevention programs, namely because it decreases the defensiveness or discomfort that one might feel speaking in a mixed gender audience. And there were some participants that mirrored this idea and said that they would like gender separation to be included as part of the program at some point. Overall, though, more research needs to be done to fully assess the differing success rates between same-gender and mixed-gender programs, and this research should take into account students' perceptions of what they find to be most beneficial. Taken together, the findings of the present study further illustrate the pervasive nature of rape myth acceptance and demonstrate that students with higher levels of rape myth acceptance are less likely to see sexual assault prevention education as necessary or beneficial. Since participation in such programs is often self-selected and mandatory programs are few and far between, this means that the individuals who might need the information the most could also be among some of the least likely to receive it. This presents a challenge for individuals who are working to implement such programs on college campuses, and the open-ended questionnaire responses reflect this challenge. Many students raised criticisms of a prevention model that includes mandatory participation, but also did not express confidence that students would attend voluntarily. Indeed, many researchers have documented the positive effects that can come as a result of prevention programming, but such research has done little to address the question of how to get students to participate in the first place. Still, it is important to note that a strong majority of students, as you saw, felt that the program they read about would be beneficial within the context of their college or university. This shows that there is still a desire for the implementation of these programs and that overall students are largely receptive to these programs. Currently, student body activities that include sexual assault prevention programs or even general sex education are only found in a minority of institutions. Because many instances, participants also indicated that rape and sexual assault were present on their campuses, and as you saw, used this to justify why the program they read about would be beneficial. Because instances of rape and sexual assault often go unreported or are only discussed among peer groups, students may have a much better understanding of the amount of occurrences of assault that are actually taking place on their campuses versus what is perceived by individuals at an administrative level. Therefore, in implementing prevention programs, it is important to pay attention to what students perceive to be the need for their campuses rather than just what is statistically reported. In addition, when asked what their individual roles in sexual assault and prevention looked like, once again, the most commonly presented roles were bystander intervention, peer education, and practicing consent. Now, bystander intervention is a clear focus of many existing prevention programs. However, there are still few programs that focus on teaching students how to practice consent with sexual partners or that focus on teaching students how to engage in peer education. Once again, since much of the discourse surrounding sexual assault on college campuses occurs at a peer level, and since a large majority of victims are raped by individuals that they themselves know or are intimate with or have previously been intimate with, this means that tackling peer education and consent could be a more all-encompassing solution for tackling these issues than focusing on something like self-defense or self-protective strategies. In addition, programs that include consent and peer education may also be more relatable for students, since such topics seem to already align with what students feel are solutions that they can easily incorporate into their lives. Overall, I would suggest that future research be done to figure out how best to target student populations, and I would also encourage individuals in administrative positions to really educate themselves on the legislation that is currently in effect, as well as on available prevention programs. There were some limitations in this research that should not be overlooked, namely heteronormativity. So both the IRMA SF scale and to a smaller extent the program description focused especially on rape committed by men against women. And there were some participants that indicated their frustration with this trend. Unfortunately, until measures themselves are designed to be more inclusive and include all genders of people in the position of both the perpetrator and the victim, as well as including all models of sexual assault, the same heteronormative view of these issues will continue to be perpetuated. So therefore, I would recommend that future research be done first and foremost to design more inclusive scales and measures. And this, I think, will allow researchers to do more complex research and to gain a better overall understanding of these issues, because it will ask participants about their opinions relating to sexual assault of all different forms, rather than just sexual assault that is committed by men against women. In addition, although steps were taken to reach the largest body of people possible for participation, there still was a somewhat limited sample, especially as you saw in terms of racial identity and gender identity. In addition, students who are already more interested in issues surrounding sexual assault could have also been more likely to participate in the study. So therefore, although the sample reflects significant variability, it still might not be fully reflective of the larger degree of variability that is out there. Briefly, I just want to thank all of the individuals who supported me in this research, and I also want to express all of my gratitude to you all for coming today. Does anybody have any questions? You can think about it.
First, let's thank LPR. I don't know about y'all, but I have to take a deep breath after that. I feel tired. Okay, that's amazing. We probably really only have time for one question, just to make sure that everybody gets a full slot for the three presenters. But I'm sure Belle would be delighted to answer questions afterwards as well. But I know there was one hand
Has there been any research done that you know of on offering some sort of motivation for having a class like in college, or potentially offering a course for a credit?
Yeah, so most of the information that I have has come from like studies of people implementing prevention programs on college campuses and then like examining the effects of those programs rather than just like studies where a university implemented the program out of their own volition, if that makes sense. So for those, there have been some that included programs that were part of the class or, you know, things like, yeah, some type of incentive for students or some sort of credit or something like that. But again, most of the studies surrounding those programs that I've seen still had relatively small sample sizes, so maybe 50 to 150 participants. And a lot of them actually focus specifically on including men in such programs and sort of trying to get men to see sexual assault as a serious issue and one that pertains to them as opposed to just women. So I would say that yes, there is research that has sort of included incentives, but they still have demonstrated relatively small sample sizes. I didn't see any program that included, you know, for example, an entire university or college in, you know, a prevention program. Most of them are still assessing a relatively small group of individuals. And they've shown really positive effects, but again, there's all kinds of limitations to that. I guess I can't answer any more questions. Thank you all so much.
So as we're in transition, I should mention that these first two projects were year-long projects conducted over 2 semesters in Advanced Research 1 and 2. So this represents quite a lot of work, as we saw in the last presentation, and as we'll see in this one as well by Deanna Dryden. So without further ado, Deanna.
Thanks, Bob. Well, thank you for being here today, everyone. I really appreciate you coming out and spending time listening to my presentation. Like Bob said, it's been a lot of research for a whole year, so I'm happy to present it today. But I did my research on the relationship between well-being and burden in family caregivers. And I wanted to begin by talking about who family caregivers are, because not everyone has a clear understanding of what that term really even means. But basically, there are 65 million people in the United States who self-identify as being a family caregiver at some point in their life. And this is a general definition, but family caregivers are defined generally as providing assistance to care recipients with chronic or disabling conditions and are not paid for their services. While this general definition is helpful, we've seen in the research that different researchers use very different definitions. It's not a universal definition. Some researchers only label a person as a family caregiver if they're providing a certain number of hours of care per week, or if they are providing a certain type of assistance, or depending on the living status, if the person is living with their care recipient, then they're considered a family caregiver. Sorry. But the differences in defining caregivers also extends to the differences in the caregiving experience. There is not a uniform experience, regardless of whether they have the same condition in the care recipient, like if you're a caregiver of someone with dementia, even that kind of relationship is not consistent across the caregiving experience. As seen by understanding how much time goes into providing care for people with dementia, there is a difference between severe dementia, where it is estimated there's 46 hours per week of care provided versus someone with no cognitive impairment where it's only 4.6 hours of care provided per week. And so these different factors of the caregiver can really affect what their experience is, whether it's really negative or it's really positive. But caregivers are important in the way that they connect to the increasing older adult population. As you can see by this graph, that based on the 2010 census data, in 2010 there was 40 million people over the age of 65. But that is projected to increase to 72 million by 2030. That's 20% of the total US population. And caregivers really provide an important role in the long-term healthcare system to provide care to older adults. And even researchers have called family caregivers the backbone and the bedrock of the long-term care system. And without them, we would be missing 40 billion hours of unpaid care per year, which is an economic value of $450 billion. Not only are they providing an economic resource to the country, but they really are providing a benefit to the families that need care for their loved ones. As you can see, the cost difference between a long-term care facility and living in the home but having a family caregiver is significant. That's an annual yearly cost to provide care for your loved one. And so family caregivers have really been recognized for this role as being super important to research and assess and understand how we can further support caregivers, because this increasing population will make their role an increasingly important one. So I wanted to talk about the research that's been done so far on family caregivers. And so I generated a word cloud based on keywords from studies starting from 1980 to present on family caregivers. The words that are larger indicate that they were more frequently cited or assessed or studied by the researchers. For example, interventions is very large, mostly because researchers found that this is the necessary next step to really understanding and supporting family caregivers. Interventions that focus on decreasing levels of depression or anxiety, or looking at how we can use cognitive behavioral therapy to help support family caregivers. Additionally, burden is also very large, as you can see. And that was frequently assessed by many researchers throughout the 1980s until present, really because the start of family caregiving research started with a 1980 article on the correlation between burden and caregiving. And so, since that initial article, this assessment of burden has been very thorough, but it's also expanded into looking at other negative concepts that are also on here, like depression, stress, anxiety, and strain. And the more you look at this word cloud, the more you can see that there are no positive constructs that were assessed by researchers. There is few and far between that any research was done on the positive aspects of the caregiving experience. And it is due to this really overwhelming negative predominant focus of the research that also reflected in the amount of scales and measures that were developed by researchers. Like, there were 216 assessments developed to specifically address negative constructs, while only 13 were developed to assess any kind of positive construct. It is due to that overwhelming imbalance in the research that I decided to focus my research on not just the negatives, but really understanding the positives. One researcher noted that the lack of attention to the positive dimension of caregiving seriously skews perceptions of the caregiving experience. And with this, that assumption has been further that skew has been further demonstrated by a 2008 review of the research, in which it was noted that there is now an underlying assumption in research that every caregiver is burdened by their role. That assumption can be very damaging to understanding when people realize, okay, I'm a caregiver now, what does that mean? And they go on the internet and it's all of these negative aspects without ever really talking about what people are really experiencing on the positive end. And so I wanted to approach this project with a holistic understanding of what the caregiving experience is. Other research has looked at some positives, but they've all defined it very differently. For example, researchers have defined positives in caregiving as rewards, benefits, gains, even uplifts. And with each of these different definitions, there's a different scale or a different measure that goes with it. And so there's a lot of inconsistency in this even little amount of research that's been done on the positives. Another inconsistency that's important for my study is the inconsistency in measuring well-being. Well-being as a concept can be thrown around in a lot of different terms without a clear understanding of what it means. For example, it was found that in most studies that said that they were assessing well-being, they were actually using a life satisfaction scale, positive affect scale, or even a happiness indicator. And even from an understanding of not looking at the research, you can see that well-being is more encompassing than just happiness or just life satisfaction. There's other factors that go into it. And some studies even said they were assessing well-being, but when you looked at their methodology, they were using a depression scale or an anxiety scale. And so there's really not only inconsistencies, but sometimes very different definitions and ways to approach things. So I wanted to approach my study with this understanding of psychological well-being that was defined by Carol Riff in 1989, in which she used these 6 concepts to really outline a more holistic understanding of well-being. These including autonomy, environmental mastery, positive relations with others, personal growth, purpose in life, and self-acceptance. And it's with this understanding of psychological well-being that I wanted to make sure that I was assessing caregivers with that understanding. So my present study. I did a community-based research project in which I was partnered with the Care Partners and the Council on Aging, which are local nonprofits. And I also worked with the Aging Coordinating Consortium to be able to pull together an understanding of what needs to be assessed in this community. And they found that family caregivers are very understudied and we don't know what they're experiencing in our own community. And it's through this partnership with those nonprofits that I was able to have access to participants. I ended up having a sample of 11 through convenience sampling, and I used a variety of recruitment methods, including flyers, posters. I went to family support group meetings and personally solicited participants, and the nonprofits also sent out mailings and emails. So despite these recruitment efforts, I only was able to have 11 participants for my study. But of those 11, these are the demographics that came out. The average age of the caregiver was 62 years old, ranging from 42 to 74. There were 9 females that participated, 1 male, and 1 person did not provide a response. The majority relationship between the caregiver and the care recipient was that the care recipient was the parent, but we did have a few that had a spousal relationship between the caregiver and care recipient. And then the average age for the care recipient was 84 and ranged from 65 to 95. And so I used 2 different scales to assess my 2 constructs, the first being burden and the other being well-being. And so the first one I used is the Zara Burden interview, which was developed in 1980. This is a 22-item questionnaire that ranges on a 5-point scale from never to nearly always. A higher score on this scale means that they have a more severe level of burden. And an example question here is that, do you feel you should be doing more for your relative? The other scale I used is the psychological well-being scale. I used the 42-item version. This comes from there being 7 questions on each dimension of psychological well-being. So for example, there's 7 questions on autonomy, 7 on self-acceptance, etc. But it's a 7-point scale ranging from strongly agree to strongly disagree, with a higher score meaning that they have higher psychological well-being. An example question, in general, I feel I'm in charge of the situation in which I live. So as far as procedure goes, the scales were administered to participants either electronically or by mail, depending on the preference of the participant. And when they received the survey, they completed the informed consent demographic questions, then the psychological well-being scale, and then the Zaret-Burton interview. Overall, this process took about 45 minutes to complete, which we'll talk about how that affected my study. But the results from the study, on average, people scored on the psychological well-being scale was 217 with a standard deviation of 37.8, and this is out of a possible score of 294. On the Zaret-Burton interview, there was an average score of 43 with a standard deviation of 15.7 and a max possible score of 88. And as this graph kind of demonstrates, there was not a significant relationship between the burden and well-being, but there was a general trend towards a negative correlation between these two concepts. Due to my sample size, I had very limited data analysis, which is partly the reason why I think I had an insignificant correlation between the two concepts. But sampling challenges are not just for me in researching family caregivers. The American Psychological Association and various reviews of the research on family caregivers have identified that this is the key challenge to assessing family caregivers. Understanding that there is a huge complexity to this population and diversity within the population that makes it very hard to assess and get a uniform sample. Also, this sample was limited by the fact that it was convenience. It was based on whoever was willing to participate through the nonprofits that I used. And also, because of how small the sample size, like I said, it limited data analysis for my correlational test, but it also limited my true intention, which was to assess specifically the purpose and life subscale of psychological well-being, because this has been hypothesized to be strongly correlated with family caregivers, meaning that family caregivers might score low on the other aspects of psychological well-being, but still score very highly on purpose and life because of their role. So with these limitations, I suggest that researchers evaluate their recruitment methods and do this by collaborating with family caregivers to really have an understanding of time constraints, what would be most accessible for caregivers, and how we can reach them most effectively. Another limitation was that the psychological well-being scale, while it uses a holistic definition of well-being, has been developed to be used in very general populations. Comparatively, the Zaret-Burton interview scale was developed to measure specifically burden in caregiving. And so with that, the psychological well-being scale might have been not specific enough to caregivers to really identify their well-being in relation to their caregiving role. It could have been outside of that and could have been more about who they were as a person and what their well-being was, regardless of their caregiving role. It is for that limitation that I suggest that future researchers develop a new measure that specifically addresses positives of caregiving. And lastly, the limitation of the study relies on self-report measures. And this is actually seen throughout the research on family caregivers, that self-report is most of the time the only measure used. I suggest that to truly understand the complexity and the diversity within the caregiving experience, that researchers start to use more qualitative data methods to be able to really understand what it means to be a caregiver. I would like to thank Bob Swope and my advanced research class, but I also would love to thank the nonprofits that I've worked with so closely over the last year, Care Partners with Allison Johnson-Sword specifically, Council on Aging with Andrea McPeters, and Ali Climo for connecting me to the Aging Coordinating Consortium, and also Linda Kendall Fields, who is part of the head of that organization. So thank you for your time and your attention today, and I would like to open it up to questions.
So thank you for saying. You mentioned that the understand that one of your goals was to do this analysis of the subscale of life. Could you just say a little bit about what trend you did see? It sounds like you didn't get some significant results there with limited sample size, but
Right.
can you just say what you were saying when you did that subscale analysis?
Well, due to only having 11 participants, I didn't actually even break it down to look at the data because it would have been too difficult to compare with such a limited and lack of data points. But I do think that, and other researchers have noted, that purpose in life is one of the key positive aspects to really this caregiving experience because of how much the care recipient is dependent on them, they feel needed, so on and so forth. So without being able to actually look at the data, I would hope that it would reflect that trend. Yes?
I'm also very interested in that purpose of life subscale. If you went back to that word cloud, which that was, to me, yeah, pretty compelling to see all those negative words up there.
Yeah.
And sad and real all at the same time. What if you were to state some of the other positives that you think might be present beyond purpose of life?
Yeah.
What would some of those look like?
Yeah, there's been, I think, 2 studies that have looked at like resiliency and considering that as part of the caregiving experience as a positive. So I would say definitely resiliency. And I think it's also the environmental mastery, not initially as a caregiver, but as you get more used to your role, you learn more things about, for example, like if you'd never heard of dementia before you found out that your care recipient had it, then you would start to have this deeper understanding of what that means as far as your understanding of it, but also how to take care of someone with it. And so throughout your caregiving process, you might feel an increase in mastery over your environment. Yes?
Is caregiving always defined as sort of caring for someone who's older than you or is of your age? Because I feel like for childcare, that seems to be also family caregiving, but
Absolutely.
I'm just curious if...
Yeah, I would say that the caregiving research is really targeted to more of the older adult population. But there are studies that are on caregiving for like a child with a chronic illness, especially like studies on children with pediatric cancer or something like that. But generally, there is no universal definition of like caregiving. Really, it's more about the situation, and the focus of the research has reflected more of the focus on older adults, though. Yes.
All right, thanks again.
Thank you.
Final presenter for this session is Matthew Greer, and he did a internship for his capstone experience, and that's kind of the model that psychology is moving to with our new major, is having a focused proposal towards either a research thesis or an internship thesis. So we're kind of seeing both models today, which is wonderful. And Matthew, as he'll tell you about, worked with a former graduate of ours and was under the supervision of Dr. Martha Knight for this particular internship. So thank you very much.
As Bob said, I'm Matthew Greer, and this semester I did my psychology internship at the Dog Door in downtown Asheville. The Dog Door is a canine behavioral center that uses ethical dog training to help maintain the dog's problem behaviors. And it is home of Asheville's only certified dog behavior consultant, Kim Brophy, who is also an alum of Warren Wilson College. A certified dog behavior consultant is uniquely qualified with expertise in evaluating and managing, modifying a wide range of challenging canine behaviors, such as aggression, fear, anxiety, phobias, neurotic or obsessive behaviors. Obedience training at the Dog Door is very unique is that in the way that we treat all dogs as individuals. We do not use blanket solutions for any dogs, and we know that all the dogs' issues are unique in their own way and that they have their own unique solutions. Once the dog is signed up for training, Kim Brophy will sit with the owner and dog for about an hour to discuss the previous behaviors and observe current ones, and will diagnose the dog and start a treatment plan. After a treatment plan is created, Kim assigns the dog to one of her trainers and puts the dog with a trainer that is more specialized in the type of behavior problem that the dog is having. The Dog Door works with owners to understand the dog's motivations, for example, making them sit before they can go outside. This gives the owner the ability to reinforce good behavior with day-to-day tasks, but each dog is motivated differently, and the Dog Door must find his motivations. Positive reinforcement, which is presenting motivating stimulus to the dog after a desired behavior is exhibited, is mainly used as our means of reinforcement. Negative reinforcement and positive punishment are never used at the Dog Door. Negative punishment, which is taking away a positive stimulus when an undesired behavior exhibited, is used in very special occasions, and I myself only saw it happen once during a group class. We had a dog who would bark at any strangers that came too close to her owner. And the way that we solved this issue was that if the dog barked, the owner would leave the dog with the trainer and would walk away. And after a few sessions, the dog learned that when it barked, it lost its mom, and the barking stopped. Our behavioral classrooms are set up similar to home environments, which is very different than your typical dog training facilities. We have fluffy couches and chairs and coffee tables and all that. And we do this so that the dog associates their classroom with their home environment, so they take what they learn in the classroom and use that new behaviors at home. We also have numerous Dog Door toys that the dogs will all play with and try out in order to find what type of toys entertain their dogs the best. These are some obedience training don'ts that I myself did before this internship for a long time with the dogs I raised, and I thought it would be helpful to all dog owners to know some of these simple tips. Shock or choke collars are never used at the Dog Door. The experience can be more traumatic than it can be helpful towards dogs, especially dogs that are already fear-based, aggressive, or anxious. These tools can be effective, it's just simply not worth the risk for it to cause a traumatic experience. Sticking a dog's nose into something is never used at the Dog Door because it's ineffective and confusing for the dog. I myself was always taught to do that growing up, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. It won't harm your relationship with the dog, but it's simply ineffective. Yelling at or spanking the dog is never used. Dogs do not understand what spanking means, even if you spank them right after the undesired behavior is shown. And physically asserting dominance by holding down the dog or standing over the dog is never used. This is just asking to be fit because the dog may think that you're being aggressive with it, and dominance theory has been discounted as an effective means to train a dog. These are some simple tips that I picked up at the Dog Door that I think every dog owner can take home and use with themselves. The first game is name and explain. When a dog is barking at an object like a cat or another dog, owners usually yell at the dog and tell them to be quiet, be quiet, be quiet. And the dog actually believes that you are also barking at the object as well. And so he will cause the dog to bark more and feel the need to defend you. Name and explain works by repeating the name of the object in a soft voice, like if it was a cat, being like, it's just a cat, it's just a cat, about 10 times to let the dog know that you know the cat's okay, you're not worried about it, so the dog shouldn't be worried about it either. Though name and explain isn't like magic, it doesn't work after just one time. If you're consistent with it, it only takes about a week or two to see a large shift in the dog's behavior. Touch game is really good for name recognition. It works by having two people stand at opposite ends of the room with a treat in between their fingers and calling the dog over. When the dog comes over, you treat it until it was good, and if the dog stays and when it was not called, you turn away and make sure that your body language says that you're not interested. This not only helps with name recognition, but it also helps getting dogs to go to the hand when people stick out their hand for them instead of jumping up at people when they meet them. Timeout is the most effective way to show a dog that the behavior he or she is exhibiting is not an appropriate one. When a dog does something like jump up, you simply say no, and you give it 3 chances to start out with. On the 3rd jump, you would take the dog and you put it on a short restraint, and you do not let the dog off the restraint until it is in a seated and calm position. No barking, no whining. The dog will quickly learn that if it wants its freedom back, it has to be in a seated position, and if it doesn't want its freedom taken away, then it needs to do the behaviors that you desire. The more and more used to dogs get to timeout, you can lower it from 3 to 2 to eventually 1. City Dog was our weekly group class where we had numerous dogs walk downtown, each with a personal trainer and their own personal owner. These dogs had issues with downtown, such as noises, people, or cars, other dogs, leash walking, and usually a mixture of all these factors. During class, dogs were maneuvered, usually in like Park Square, somewhere kind of quieter, and the groups would interact from afar so the dogs get used to other dogs passing by and people being in their space. Our intention was not to get the dogs to meet, this was not a socialization, but just to get the dogs to be okay with other dogs being somewhat in their space. As the sessions progressed, so did the intensity of what the dogs went through, and we would move from Park Square to busier parts of Astral, where there were more noises, more people, and just more random factors that could upset the dog. Service and therapy dog training is another program offered at the Dog Door. Sadly, I did not have the time on my schedule to shadow as many appointments as I'd like. I only got to see 1. So I thought that I would just state the differences between service and therapy dogs because they usually get grouped into kind of the same thing. Service dogs have a set job that varies with each service dog, and they must receive extensive training starting out as puppies. Usually, service dogs are used as guide dogs or signal dog. A signal dog may be a dog that is trained to warn its owner of an impending seizure, or if they're deaf, of an alarm or telephone going off. And then there are physical service dogs that help with duties such as pulling wheelchairs. Service dogs do not count as pets. They do not follow pet building or transportation laws, and they are allowed everywhere. Service dogs are not encouraged to socialize or interact with any other dogs while they're on the job, but once that vest is off, they can just be normal dogs at home. Therapy dogs, on the other hand, while also receiving extensive training, don't have to start as puppies. They can start at almost any age. Their responsibilities are to provide psychological or physiological therapy to individuals. These dogs usually have very stable temperaments and are friendly, easygoing personalities, like golden retrievers. Typically, they visit various institutions like hospitals, schools, psychotherapy offices, nursing homes, and more. However, unlike service dogs, therapy dogs are encouraged to interact with a variety of people and dogs while they're on duty. The animal shelter is where I got my most hands-on experience at the Dog Door. Usually I was just shadowing appointments, but here I was actually doing the dog training. I was a target trainer, and a target trainer is one that works with dogs with high impulse, low self-control, and a lack of regulating arousal levels. Target dogs are only allowed to be handled by target trainers. By limiting the amount of people that interacts with these target dogs, the target trainers can help create a consistent environment for these dogs. I mostly worked with jumping, nipping, over-arousal. I worked on helping the dogs learn to make good decisions, as well as take breaks when they got too over-aroused and time out. After a few sessions with the dog, and once it started to jump less and be much calmer, I would work on basic commands such as sit, down, and wait in order to help the dog become more adoptable. The float bowl, which is basically a giant cat toy, which is the pole and a toy on the end of a string, was my most effective tool for hanging out with these dogs because it gave me the ability to allow these dogs to jump and run around and play tug while standing still and not putting myself in harm's way. I also worked on a kennel presentation at the animal shelter by walking around to the different dog kennels and asking the dog to sit and treat when it did so. I also gave treats to dogs that were already in a seated position or in a down position and were not barking at passerbyers. This helped the dog seem more relaxed when potential owners came because they would sit like they were waiting for the treat, thus increasing its adoptability. I also got to shadow Safers at the animal shelter, which is the process the dog is first put through when it comes into the shelter to judge its aggression, its likeliness to people or dogs, and its resource guarding. The dogs would be put through a series of tests with different objects, such as reaching for the toy it has, and we would see how it would react to that situation. The Safer is recorded on the dog's kennel information, so new owners have an idea of what the dog is like before adopting it. I also worked with resource guarding at the animal shelter. A resource is anything that matters or that is associated with something that matters to the dog, and resource guarding is when the dog guards that food or object from another person or human. To work on resource guarding, you put the dog in the mildest condition as possible, starting with something like dry kibble or a toy it's not overly interested in. And then I would take away the food or toy, give them a treat, and then instantly give them the food or toy right back. This teaches the dog that when something is taken away, better things will replace it, and over time, the dog will learn to associate things being taken away as a positive thing, even if the treat isn't distributed. As the dog becomes more and more comfortable with the trainer taking its food or object, the food or object is increased to something more desirable, such as human food or wet food, and the process is repeated again. However, the buildup of these objects is very slow, and when a resource guarding session begins, the trainer should work their way up from the undesirable kibble back to the high-end object every single session. One of my favorite parts of the shelter was puppy socialization. At the shelter, if we had a puppy that seemed fearful or aggressive of dogs, we would put it in a puppy socialization class because it was important to deal with these issues at such a young age so that when they became adults, these issues weren't worse, as well as so the puppy could be properly socialized before it grew up. We would do this by having both the puppy and dog on a leash in a room, held by two different trainers, and we would allow the puppy to go up and sniff the dog and then call it right back and give it a treat. As the two dogs got more and more comfortable with each other, we would allow contact to last for longer periods of time, building up to where they could eventually play together under supervision in case timeouts were needed in order to lower arousal levels. This controlled socialization helped the puppy build good relationships with other dogs, and these relationships can help the dog associate positive things with new dogs that it would meet in the future. Drive is an upcoming program being launched by Kim Brophy in July to help new dog owners decide what type of dog best suits them and their lifestyle. Drive asks why so many people put less thought into bringing home a dog than they do into purchasing a car. Drive gives owners the ability to learn how to manage, drive, their dog. The dog categories are split into these 10 types: hybrid, scooter, ATV, dirt bike, train, cop car, SWAT car, tank, hot rod, and dragon. Kim currently has a phone application in the works where new dog owners can fill in specifications about dogs that they are interested in to see if that dog fits their current lifestyle. This app will be used by the Asheville Humane Society and the dog door for new owners upon completion, and eventually on the app market. LEGS, which stands for Learning, Environment, Genetics, and Self, is the scientific foundation of the Drive initiative. All 4 components of the dog need to be understood in order to understand where the dog is coming from. L is for learning, which is learned behavior, associations, and socialization. E is for environment, both physical and social environment. G is for genetics, evolutionary point of view, and looks at both genetic dispositions and epigenetics. And S for self, is for health, nutrition, and personality. While the dog door is mainly a behavioral center, we also have a retail shop in front of our behavior class. They stock very sturdy and durable toys, healthy treats, puzzles, leashes, collars, and all that type of stuff. Many of these items are not available in your basic pet store. Some of my job responsibilities were data entry, filing and organizing, running the register, organizing merchandise, cleaning the store and training rooms, opening and closing the store, and talking to customers. This picture on the left is a picture of me and my dog Yuki on a Saturday where I got to run the store completely by myself. It was awesome to be trusted with that much responsibility by the dog store staff, and it was just really cool to be working on the busiest day of our week and talking to customers and feeling like I really made that day happen. The pictures on the right are pictures of the store itself and some of our great toys. This picture of me on the left is me in 4th grade at a Humane Society camp with the dog George, who I got to train for 2 weeks in order to increase his adoptability. It was then that I realized that I really loved hanging out with dogs and that I knew that you didn't need to own a dog in order to love a dog. Since then, I have really been hoping to be a dog trainer, and luckily for me, the dog door has offered to continue my internship for the next year following graduation, and they told me if all goes well, they will hire me on as a canine behaviorist. After my year-long internship, I will take my CCPDT, which is the Universal Dog Behaviorist license, and as time goes on, I hope to get my ADPT as well, which allows me to work with fear-based dogs, which has always been my main goal and my long-term dream. I want to give a special thanks to the entire Warren Wilson Psychology Department for helping me make this a reality, to my advisor, Catherine Burleson, for believing in my passion, believing that I could do this, and helping me get my schedule set up for this, my intern advisor, Martha Knight Oakley, for helping me organize this internship, and for also connecting me to Kim 2 years ago when I was a social work major and making me realize that psychology was my path. Big special thanks to my internship coordinator, Caitlin Morrow, the girl pictured on the left, who answered all of my questions, showed me the ropes of dog training, and was very flexible with my Warren Wilson schedule. And another thanks to all the dog tour staff who was super welcoming and open to all my questions, and to my friends and family who supported me throughout the semester. Thank you.
Plenty of time for questions, and even some for Belle Pilar if people were here earlier and she got shut out. That was beautiful, thank you. It warmed my heart. That's awesome. Questions for Matthew?
Out of curiosity for the service dogs, you were saying that when they get to go home and speak like normal dogs, are they able to distinguish like what they do with a family member compared to a person next door?
Yeah, I think so. Mainly it's the vet. You teach the dog that when they're in that vest, they are in job mode and that they must be on the job the entire time that vest is on. But then once you take that service dog vest off, they're about to go out and play, be in the yard, and do whatever normal things dogs like to do.
Okay. And also, so if anything were to happen to a family member, you think, like, do you know any research about how they react to this, how they would do like if they're wearing that?
What do you mean? Like if like something else happened to them?
Or an accident or something like that?
The way that they alert is by like dogs, especially with seizures, know that it's happening a few minutes beforehand, and they have a certain bark that they give the owner that they train them to do to let them know you're about to have a seizure, you need to sit down.
Okay.
So what were the different types for like the drive program? Are they like the name, if it's a hybrid, is that the kind of car the dog should be in, or?
No, I meant to bring this with me. But basically they're all like mixed. The only one I can really remember is like Dragon, it's like the bigger dogs, like St. Bernards and stuff like that. And then there's like a paragraph description talking about their qualities, what type of house they best would live in, if they need a front yard or a backyard, because there's a big difference between having a front yard where people pass by and a backyard where they don't have to see anybody and stuff like that. And if you want, I can get you the like actual character back here. Okay, cool.
Are those do's and don'ts online somewhere? I'm thinking about that.
They're not, but I can definitely email them to you anytime.
We will probably upload all of these to our psychology website, these PowerPoints.
Awesome.
Other questions? Well, I want to thank everybody who presented today. I thought there were 3 fantastic jobs, just beautifully done, just wonderful work. And thank you all for coming and being such a great audience.